Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Hillsborough County Democratic Committee, I want to welcome you to our forum series. We had a series of 4 formats last fall, and we're continuing that this spring with our first here tonight, Don't Lose Your Voice, a Voting Rights Forum. We are very fortunate to have an exemplary panel tonight, and this should be a great session. A couple of little housekeeping details to go over. This is a webinar format, not a meeting. So you are going to notice that you do not have access to chat and that you're not able to unmute yourselves. However, we do want to hear from you. My colleague Katie Cudshaw and I will be monitoring the chat regularly throughout the presentation, as will our host, Representative Matt Wilhelm. So please put your questions in there in comments as we go along, and we will ask those questions throughout. We are also recording this, and it will be on YouTube, and we will be emailing that link to you folks in a couple of days. And speaking of Representative Wilhelm, he is our moderator host tonight, and he is quite an achieved person. He has had a career in recruiting, developing, and uniting diverse teams to identify challenges, develop solutions, and strategizing to work for change. He grew up in Nashua, received his BA in communications and political science at Plymouth State. And then he joined the City Year in New Hampshire as an AmeriCorps team leader in high-need, under-resourced public schools. Representative Wilhelm earned his master's in public administration at UNH and has spent more than a decade working in the nonprofit sector. He currently serves on the boards of Volunteer New Hampshire and Calling All Crows, and chaired New Hampshire's Service Year Workforce Commission during the 1920 legislative session. Matt and his wife Jody operate a dormitory-style housing complex for AmeriCorps members in the downtown Manchester area. They are also the very proud parents of Ben and Rosie. So without further ado, I would say, take it away, Representative Wilhelm.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bev. Really great to be with you this evening, and great to be with the Hillsborough County Democrats. Really excited about the conversation that we have ahead. It was really wonderful to see so many of you yesterday for the New Hampshire Democratic Party's very first coordinated campaign office opening alongside Senator Hassan and Congressman Pappas and others here in Manchester. There are other office openings that are planned across the state in the coming months. And, you know, I've got a real vested interest in these office openings and in our field strategy for this coming election season as chair of the New Hampshire House Dems Victory Committee, which is the election arm of the House Democratic Caucus in Concord, and helping to lead our efforts to win back the House majority this fall. And our path to victory, it really includes so many important races right here in Hillsborough County. So I hope everybody's ready to knock doors this summer and fall. It's going to really be an all hands on deck effort. As Bev mentioned, my name is Matt Wilhelm. I represent Hillsborough County District 42 in the New Hampshire House. So that covers Manchester wards 1, 2, and 3. It will soon be wards 1, 2, 10, 11, and 12 as a result of redistricting. Those maps have been signed by the governor, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about redistricting this evening. Not all the maps have been signed, but the House maps are the law of the land. And I've had the privilege of serving on the House Special Committee on Redistricting this term, along with Representative Bergeron, and really just grateful for the opportunity to join you all this evening for this really important panel discussion with some real champions of voting rights across the state. I don't have to tell you, but voting rights are very much under attack, both nationally and especially here in New Hampshire, as Republicans and radical libertarians propose legislation and use other tactics to strip Granite Staters of their right to free and fair elections. Tonight's conversation is going to focus on consequences and outcomes of the current redistricting and gerrymandering, current election law legislation that we are now looking at post-crossover when the House bills go to the Senate and the Senate bills come over to the House. And we're really going to be talking about the impact on voters, including minority communities, and ways that citizen action can really help stem the tide of voter suppression tactics and ensure fairer outcomes. So hopefully this conversation won't be all doom and gloom. We will share some strategies for how you can help mitigate the damage and make sure that voting rights are front and center in Concord during the final 2 months of this legislative session. Without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our panel, which I'm really, really excited about. I'm going to start with Liz Tentarelli, who is the president of the New Hampshire League of Women Voters. Liz had a career spanning 30 years teaching high school and college students, including 19 years at Merrimack College in North Andover, Mass. Liz has been a member of the League of Women Voters, a nonpartisan political organization, for more than 25 years, and president of the state league since 2009. The league is a direct descendant organization of the women's suffrage movement. Liz was appointed in 2015 by Governor Maggie Hassan to serve on the Citizens Advisory Board to the New Hampshire Correctional Facility for Women. She's presented courses on the issues surrounding female incarceration through Adventures in Learning at Colby Sawyer College and OLLI, O-L-L-I, in Concord and Manchester. Liz has held appointed offices in 2 town governments and served 12 years as an elected library trustee in Newbury, New Hampshire. In 2016, she joined the board of the New Hampshire Library Trustees Association, where she now serves on the Education Committee. So Liz, glad you're with us. Excited to have you with us.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, and we're also going to welcome Attorney Henry Clementowitz with the ACLU of New Hampshire. Henry's work focuses on litigation and state house advocacy in support of civil rights and civil liberties, particularly in the areas of voting rights, governmental records, due process, and freedom of speech. Henry joined the ACLU of New Hampshire as a staff attorney after almost 3 years of working for a large New Hampshire law firm. He's especially proud of his work to create a partnership between that firm and the New England Innocence Project, which seeks exoneration of wrongly convicted individuals in New Hampshire. Prior to that, he clerked for judges of Rockingham Superior Court. He's represented clients in the New Hampshire Supreme Court, Superior Courts, all divisions of the Circuit Court, and the United States District Court for the District of New Hampshire. Henry received his JD from Georgetown University Law Center, where he was a notes development editor for the American Criminal Law Review, and his BS from Columbia University. Henry's a New Hampshire native and lives in Portsmouth with his wife and son Micah, who turned 7 months old tomorrow. We found out as we were waiting in the green room, and he traveled to Hillsborough County to be with us this evening on this call. It was not a prerequisite, but he's really, you can tell his commitment to this panel. He wants to be part of the Hillsborough County family once again today. So Henry, glad to have you with us. Appreciate you squeezing us in.
Thank you so much for having me.
And then finally is a House colleague of mine. He's a native of Nashua, Representative Paul Bergeron, retired from his position as Nashua's city clerk in 2015 after nearly 16 years of service. Previous employment experience includes 5 years with the Manchester City Clerk's Office, where he worked on elections and licensing, and 17 years in retail management, including 8 years in the family's former menswear store, Bergeron's Incorporated, on West Pearl Street. He's a former chair of the New Hampshire City and Town Clerks Legislative Committee, member of the Secretary of State's 2005 Help America Vote Act evaluation team for the development and procurement of a statewide voter registration system. And following his retirement, Paul was a faculty member at Nashua Community College in the Department of English from 2015 to 19. And I've gotten to know Paul a little bit over the course of the last few months. We've been working on redistricting together. And Paul is also the deputy ranking member on the House Election Law Committee. So Paul, thanks for joining us. Glad you're with us today.
Thank you, Matt.
And I guess just at the outset, want to say, we want this to be a conversation, and we want to let this conversation go in the direction that you'd like to see it go. This is a bit of a choose your own adventure. So there are lots of issues at stake. We've got 3 really prominent experts on voting rights and redistricting, but thought we might just kind of open things up to kind of get us going. We'll just take a few minutes if each of you want to just share what's on your mind. I mean, we're just coming off of crossover at the New Hampshire House and the New Hampshire Senate. Some bills have died on the floor of the House, and others are making its way to the other chamber. What do you see as the biggest threats to our democracy right now, and how are you thinking about the next couple months before we head into election season? Liz, do you want to start us off?
Sure, I would like a week off. Crossover, I've earned a vacation of a week, but we don't get that because we're plowing right in now as the House gets some of these Senate bills. And we're still in the midst of redistricting. Frankly, when all this started, a year ago was the first meeting of the redistricting special committees. I thought we'd have maps by now. I didn't expect I'd like them, but I thought we'd have them and they would be in law, and candidates for office would know which district they were in and could be filing, and that hasn't happened. So what I see coming up is a real struggle to get redistricting maps that are fair. And if we lose that battle, at least to get maps that people can learn to live with somehow. And the League of Women Voters is nonpartisan. We have been fighting since 2004 for an independent redistricting commission. And we lost that fight when the governor vetoed bills that passed in 2019 and 2020. So now we have partisan maps, and we have to figure out what to do about that. The title of our program here is, about your voice. Well, your vote is your voice. And when the maps are not fair, some voters lose their voices. So I see that as one of the big challenges. Thank you.
Matt, I'll jump in if that's okay.
Yeah, please do, Paul. Thanks.
I'll talk a little bit about what I'm seeing happening with the House election laws and the Senate bills that have just crossed over, give people an idea of the climate that we're experiencing up in Concord. The House Election Law Committee had to consider 57 bills this session. These are House bills. And 41 of those 57 were killed. And by killed, I mean they were found inexpedient to legislate, they were tabled, or they were sent to interim study, which is kind of a kind way to let them expire, although sometimes some good content is developed in interim study and can be used to create legislation in the next term. Amongst the more extreme bills that were killed were bills that would have prohibited the use of electronic voting devices, requiring that all folded ballots be counted by hand at the end of the night. And to give you an idea of just how much work that is, more than a third of the ballots cast in the last state general election were absentee ballots, were folded ballots. So that would have really extended the process during the evening. Another would have required that after the polls closed in the next day or two, all ballots that were used at the polling places would be shipped up to the Secretary of State for storage. And of course, the Secretary of State's office doesn't have the room to hold all those ballots following an election. Another would have required a statewide forensic audit of the 2020 election results, similar to what occurred in Windham, but on a statewide scale. It would have cost the city millions. And still another would have required that ballots being stored in communities be stored under lock and key in areas that had video monitoring equipment on 24/7. So those I would consider kind of the fringe bills, the fringe legislation, which even a lot of moderate and conservative mainstream Republicans couldn't support. Of the 16 remaining bills that were voted ought to pass or ought to pass with amendment, 8 of those went on consent calendars. And what that means is all or almost all of the Election Law Committee, both Republicans and Democrats, supported those bills either as they were written or as they were amended. And then 8 were sent over to the Senate for their consideration. Those 8 bills that are being considered by the Senate now, they're starting to hold hearings on them, and some actions may be taken on those. What we really want to watch now in the House side are the 12 Senate bills that have crossed over. Some of those have bipartisan support. They're sponsored by members of both parties, but some of them are really, we should be looking at and keeping a close eye on. One of them, for example, would move the date of the state primary election to the second Tuesday in August. That's not as controversial as folks might think, but it is something that you might want to keep an eye on. Another one is setting up an auditing process for testing the electronic ballot counting devices for the 2022 state elections. It's very doable. It's the result of a Senate study committee on this issue last year, and they made some recommendations to at least start some kind of audit practice. And I think that will receive some good support too. But two to keep in mind and to watch. Senate Bill 418, relative to verification of voter affidavits, really talks about the creation of affidavit ballots, so that if someone were to come to the polling place without an ID, they would get a special ballot. Their name would be matched up with the number of the ballot. If they didn't produce an ID within 10 days, and there was a very close recount, the Secretary of State would require the moderators to retrieve that voter's ballot. And it would probably, if there's no voter identification having been submitted, it would not be counted in the final results. That ballot would be deducted from the final results total. Of course, there are a lot of problems with that, and some constitutional questions, as well as the fact that ballots are supposed to be secret, and this is a process that's going to match up a specific ballot with a specific voter. So that should be a concern as well. With that, I think I will put a stop to it. And there's so many bills out there. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I should say one other thing, and I mentioned this before.
Well, we're definitely going to want to hear. What's that, Paul?
Just one other thing, if I might.
Yeah.
As the bills are being crossed over, that's where you really want to watch what's going on in committees of conference. And as an example, Senate Bill or House Bill 292, which deals with the absentee ballot request form, the Senate only made one minor change on it. All they did was ask for a line where the voter would print his or her name on the outer absentee ballot affidavit envelope. And yet the chair of election law wants to send that bill to a committee of conference. And what that is telling me is that there may be an effort made to retain or to hold all the bills dealing with absentee ballot forms and hold a single committee of conference and take all those bills together and produce something which the majority might have an interest in seeing passed. So that's something to keep an eye on in the next couple of months. That's where the sausage is going to be made. So we'll watch it.
Not our favorite part of the political process, to be sure. Well, as folks have questions, or something piques your interest, I hope you'll throw questions in the chat here. We'll be keeping an eye on the questions that come in, and we'll incorporate them into our conversation this evening. So please don't hesitate to ask for clarity. Some people have been following the Election Law Committee pretty closely. Some people have been following the redistricting process pretty closely. Others may just be tuning in, really for the first time as we think about how these bills are impacting our state's democracy. So there are no bad questions here. Just put your questions in the Q&A function, and we'll be able to process those, include them in the conversation. Henry, let's bring you into the conversation here. How are you thinking about where we're at right now, and what are you most concerned about as we head into the home stretch?
Sure. Thank you, Matt. So first, I have to say that, like, standard disclaimer in all these events, as with the League of Women Voters, the ACLU of New Hampshire is a non-partisan organization, and we don't do electoral politics. We don't support or endorse any candidates for any office. We just do issue-based advocacy. So with that general disclaimer, I'm always here, happy to talk to anyone about voting and redistricting. So thank you for having me. My story, the way I've been looking at this session is a majority party sort of stymied, trying to make voting harder, stymied by the fact that in New Hampshire it's already pretty hard, and sort of bumping up against the fact that New Hampshire elections are pretty unique, and so actually, like, all things considered, given the story of the big lie in 2020, and the people who hold the corner office and the Senate and the House majorities, I don't actually think the story has been as bad as it could have been. So let me just explain a little bit. I think what we saw immediately after the 2020 election was people across the country, legislators of one political party, filing bills to do all sorts of things to make voting harder, curtailing early voting, ending no excuse absentee voting, banning the use of drop boxes or drive-through votings. They can't do any of that in New Hampshire because we already don't have any of it. So, like, you can't end no excuse absentee voting in New Hampshire. You can't end early voting in New Hampshire because we don't have either of those. So what we saw in 2020 or 2021, excuse me, last year, was a number of bills that were introduced, mostly on the House side, designed to make voting harder. And I think basically they weren't particularly well thought out, and we didn't really see anything too bad become law last year. Then over the summer, Liz and every other voter in the state of New Hampshire had a tremendous legal victory in a case, funnily enough, called New Hampshire Democratic Party versus Gardner, wherein the New Hampshire Supreme Court struck down 2017's SB 3. And then we saw statements from the chair of the House and Senate election law committees and the governor all saying that what they want to do is find some way to replace SB 3. So I think what they've settled on is, as Representative Bergeron alluded to, is Senate Bill 418, which I know we'll get into a little bit later on in the show. But I think that the best legal minds in the anti side of the aisle got together, and this is what they came up with. And I think it's unconstitutional in a number of ways. I think it would cost the state a ton of money. One of the things that we saw after SB 3 was that the state of New Hampshire paid over $4 million to lawyers, $3 million of which went straight to Mark Elias and the Elias Law Group, or Perkins Coie. And I think they're going to end up probably having to write that check again if SB 418 passes. But on the other hand, we saw a lot of the less well thought out efforts die. And then just to tie this in, to a little bit of good news, we've been running at ACLU a redistricting campaign, working with a ton of coalition partners like the League of Women Voters. And we saw, like 3 weeks ago, maybe it was, the governor announced that he was going to veto the gerrymandered congressional maps. And look, I'm not in the governor's head. I don't know why anyone does anything, but I can tell you that when we drew our campaign up, that was pretty much the best option. And we knew that the only way it was going to happen was a drumbeat of citizens and activists expressing their outrage over anything partisan and gerrymandered. And that's exactly what happened. And, it wasn't just us, and it wasn't just Democrats. We saw former Republican Speaker of the House, Gene Chandler, put out a statement saying he opposed the maps. The editorial board of the Union Leader said that they opposed the congressional maps. We saw a respected political scientist from UNH say that he tried to draw more partisan electoral maps for Republicans and was unable to. And part of what happened was, and if I may, I'm going to use my all-time favorite Liz Tentarelli quote in a second, but former New Hampshire Supreme Court Justice and now current Representative Lynn, and as described by Liz Tentarelli, a man who should know better, said on the record in a meeting of the House Special Redistricting Committee that of course political considerations went into the drawing of those congressional maps. And I think that just grossed everyone out. A poll was done that showed that 80% of New Hampshire opposed the blatant congressional gerrymander. And so with a lot of pressure from folks like you all, we actually had a pretty big win. And so for me, this is the story of this session has actually been like kind of a success insofar as it could have been a whole lot worse. We didn't see anything terrible last year. I think we're starting to see the antis coalesce around one bill, but we've had some public advocacy wins and communication wins sort of against all odds. So that's what's been on my mind. And unlike Liz, I don't need a week off because I just finished up paternity leave and actually had a dream about Secretary of State Dave Scanlon and talking to him about the New Hampshire Constitution. And when you're dreaming about the work, it's maybe time to go back to work.
That's great. Well, I'll let you know if there are any questions asking about the details of that dream. But otherwise,
I'm happy to get into it too.
Yeah. Well, let's talk more about redistricting. I mean, I think that we're sort of at an interesting spot with redistricting. Liz, I don't know if you have anything you want to add on that topic.
I do, before we go much farther.
Yeah.
We all are familiar with the term gerrymandering. And so people look at a map and they look at a strangely shaped district and they say, well, that must be gerrymandered. But for those who aren't as in the thick of it as we are, I want to point out that gerrymandering simply means you're deciding which towns are in which district. And what we're seeing in New Hampshire is that those decisions are made for partisan advantage. So the resultant shape is not the thing, although it can clue you in that why did they group those towns together, that are spread out in a long skinny line. It's not the shape, it's the fact that those towns have been grouped so that one party the minority party is kind of jammed into a few districts and the majority party has the advantage in most of the others. So when we talk about your vote as your voice, if you're in a district that is not of the same party, that is the towns grouped there are likely to go in a different direction, what happens to your voice? Is the only vote that counts the primary? Because it's almost pre-programmed that Democrats will win some districts and Republicans will win others. And so that's what I want people to keep in mind. You really have to know what the past voting record of each town is. And when you clump those towns into districts, that affects the outcome. But more than that, it squelches voters' voices. And only the primary really has much meaning. So I just wanted to get that out there. Thank you, Matt.
No, that's helpful framing to think about the process that we're in the middle of right now. Paul, you and I serve on the House Redistricting Committee. We had a busy, fall where we went around the state. We saw so many activists, so many concerned citizens showing up, expressing their concerns, their points of view related to redistricting. Not just with the congressional districts, which has gotten a lot of press, but also, the House maps, the New Hampshire House maps, the state Senate maps, county commissioner maps, perhaps a little less sexy, and the executive council maps. Do what's your take on kind of where we stand right now and the work that's ahead?
Well, most of the work's done in terms of the map making, except for the Senate, Congress, and executive councils. The process that we went through, while informative to us on some levels, I think we probably expected the kinds of comments we would hear. We heard calls for fair and open redistricting, transparency. Any town that was entitled to its own state rep should get it. Avoid filterials where possible. If you have to have a filterial, make sure the towns have something in common, some common interest, whether it's a shared school district or water districts, or they maybe share elements of the economy together. And I guess that wasn't surprising. Maybe what was surprising is how we heard it in every county, because we went to all 10 counties. What disappointed me is that you can't have fair and open and transparent redistricting if there are no subcommittees working in a public arena arguing how to draw the maps. And so what happened after all these hearings were done is the committee chair directed individuals, she didn't say the parties should bring it in, but she said, bring whatever maps you have and let's discuss them. And of course, the Republican maps were brought forward and with minor changes were adopted. So I was disappointed in that respect. I don't think it really was as fair and open a process as it could have been. Obviously, COVID had something to do with that. We weren't meeting a lot in committees in the House, and it may have been difficult to have subcommittee meetings that were open and available for the public to participate in. But that as it may, it wasn't as open a process as I would have liked. Now, if you want me to expand on any of that, feel free to direct me.
Yeah, well, and here's a question that's coming in now. So this is from Matthew, who asks, he says, my biggest concern is the combination of partisan gerrymandering and the Free Staters, with districts that have been stacked to favor one party, then the most extreme elements of that party can capture the nomination by winning the primary. What can be done to overcome the extreme elements? Liz, Henry, it looks like maybe you want this one.
Yeah, so let me just say that, so ACLU of New Hampshire, we hired an independent data analytics company to do an analysis of all the maps that were put forward by everyone. And so sometimes it's hard to visualize things, like especially with the New Hampshire State House, because of the floterials and the way that it's divvied up. But just to give you all some top line numbers, under the current plan in 2020 and 2012, there were 196 of 400 seats were more GOP leaning than the center of the state, and the median partisan lean was 0.05% in favor of the Republicans. Under 2022, that 196 seat number is going to become 214, and the partisan lean difference between the median seat and the state of a whole is going to be 0.69%. So just through drawing the maps, 18 seats we can expect to shift and become more Republican overall, enough to create a majority. So that's the bad news. I mean, from a partisan perspective, it's bad news for you all. From my perspective, it's bad news in that it's just really an improper way to use the process, right? Like, I don't think our framers intended, when they allowed the legislature to draw the districts, that this is how they would do it. I mean, we know the framers hated partisanship and factions. Maybe they're inevitable, but that was not the envisioned plan. And yet that's what we're seeing is happening. There are some things to keep in mind. Number one, gerrymanders will fade over time, right? Like, it's done every 10 years, but there are population changes and people move, and changes in birth rates will change over time. So we're not doomed for the next 10 years. It's they don't last as long as that. Number two, Depending on how they're done, people can out-organize a gerrymander. Like in New Hampshire, regardless of the partisan lean, a state house district has the ideal population of 3,443 people. It probably takes a couple $100s to run a successful campaign. A candidate can knock on every single door in their district themselves if they work hard enough. So good candidates can matter, so can good campaigns. To some extent, as the national mood changes or the political environment changes, people can out-hustle some of these gerrymanders. So, it's not all doom and gloom all the time. But the problem that the question writer identified is very real. It's absolutely the case that we're seeing fewer and fewer competitive districts. And so, for example, 538, the statistical analysis website has great numbers and charts that show that, even as Democrats nationally did a little bit better than anticipated on the congressional redistricting process, one completely clear trend is the number of competitive districts is rapidly decreasing. And that's, people get more brazen, they bring better software to bear. Parts of the Voting Rights Act are weakened. Federal court closes its doors to claims of partisan gerrymandering. And so it's absolutely true that we're seeing fewer and fewer competitive districts. And so that does mean that where the only competitive district is election as a primary, you're going to naturally see people drift to the extremes and compromise, and Washington and Concord is going to be less. So some good news, some bad news, I guess.
Yeah, well, and I think that the number of competitive seats, shrinking is something that we're seeing at both the federal level, with the way that all the congressional maps are being drawn across the country, and it's something that we're seeing with the New Hampshire House maps. But like you said, it's in New Hampshire, given the way that we operate, if you're committed to knocking those doors, you can absolutely overcome the partisanship of a district. I think at least the House Democrats look at the map that we've been handed and say, this is going to be tough, but it is not insurmountable. I think we can still absolutely compete, and it's surely not as gerrymandered, for example, as the congressional map, where then you're feeling like you're walking up a pretty steep hill. Liz, I wonder if you might be willing to talk just a little bit about the option that we had if we had taken advantage of it, which is independent redistricting. That we didn't have to go through this process in the way it's played out over the course of the last several months. It could have been an entirely different process, and I know that's something that League of Women Voters have been fighting for alongside champions in the legislature from both sides of the aisle in recent legislative terms.
You're absolutely right. So in the bill that actually got through the legislature 2 years in a row, 2019 and 2020, there would have been a commission of non-legislators created, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 5 members of neither party. So there's our undeclared voters. And as you know, in New Hampshire, the number of registered Republicans and Democrats is about the same, but the largest group of the 3 is the undeclared voters. So we would have had plenty of people to choose from, and these would not have been currently sitting legislators. So those 15 people who would have sat on this commission would have to do a give and take as they tried to create some maps. One party could not design them all by themselves, which is what has happened here. Each of the maps that's been passed in at least one, or in the case of the House, both bodies, has been designed by the majority party. With an independent redistricting commission, that would not have happened. It would have required 9 of the 15 people to agree that this district map, whatever it is, House, Senate, Congress, etc., is fair and is acceptable. And I really do think that by the governor vetoing those bills when they passed, we lost an opportunity. And now we do have the problem that one of the viewers asked about, a much greater opportunity for extremists at the extremes of both parties of winning in their districts. And I don't know where that puts the centrists. Many voters regard themselves as centrists, and they're not going to have those choices, I'm afraid. So that's the issue. I have not given up on an independent redistricting commission. I may be dead in 10 years, but I still hope that I can fight for it before then. I've been testifying on this since I think 2008 for the first time. So I'm going to keep trying.
Well, a lot of these things in the New Hampshire House take a while, and this is one that, there was bipartisan consensus that this is the direction that we should take, and unfortunately it was vetoed. So
and not for nothing, the bill to create the Independent Redistricting Commission passed the state Senate unanimously. So
yeah, 24-0.
Yeah.
Henry, I've got a couple legal questions that have come in here. I'm hoping you might be able to
sure
to shed some light on. One is from Sue, who says, Senator Gray that redrew the executive council map. What are legalities for him to do that? A committee didn't redraw, he did. And the congressional map that Governor Sununu vetoed, doesn't he have to back up and submit it to committees, House and Senate?
So the answer to the first question is it is legal. It's disappointing when these amendments happen after a public hearing. There won't be another opportunity for the public to comment about that map in the Senate, but there will be a public hearing in the House on it. But the Senate is allowed, and their committees are allowed to adopt committee amendments, and that's what happened here. As to the veto, it's an interesting question. So I'm not an expert on House parliamentary procedure, but here's my understanding. The maps that HB 50, I think, that passed the House and Senate and are on their way to the governor's desk that he has promised to veto, once he vetoes it, they can't be amended. The House or the Senate is just technically just voting on whether to override the veto or not. So assuming, I think a safe assumption that the veto is sustained, that bill is going to be dead. So what's going to happen? Well, we're after crossover, which means that without suspending the rules, the House can't introduce any new bills and the Senate can't introduce any new bills. So the only way that new congressional districts can be legislatively redrawn is if the Senate amends a House bill that's already passed, or the House amends a Senate bill that's already passed and puts the new maps into sort of a non-germane amendment. So that could happen. It probably will. If it doesn't, last week, the Elias Law Group, Paul Toomey and McLean Middleton filed an impasse lawsuit in Hillsborough Superior Court Southern Division, asking the state court to declare that the political branches had reached an impasse and to require and to draw as the court the maps themselves. So this happened actually in the 2002 cycle. Governor Lynch, Governor Shaheen maybe, whoever was governor in like 2002, when I was 15, vetoed the maps, and then her veto was sustained, and so the courts redrew the state House and state Senate maps. So if the political branches can't get it together, a court will probably do it. I don't know. I guess if I were to put money on it, I'd say it's probably likely that the House Republicans and Sununu can get together on a map that they all support, but it's not a sure thing. We all know sort of how disorganized the legislative process is. So that's, I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I think it's good. So
the
much so
Q&A,
that Representative Bergeron had also offered to answer that question after you started going. He said, I think Henry's covered the basis. So I want to throw this. Here's another legal question. This one is from Marie, and there's a similar one from Matthew, which is any chance these maps can be successfully defeated in the courts, or what are our litigation options here?
Yeah. Okay. So this is like where it's sort of I'm not going to. Okay. How do I preface this? I'm going to be talking in generalities without like reference to any specific conversations that may or may not be happening. So in general, here's what I'll say. In 2019, in a case called Rucco versus Common Cause, the United States Supreme Court held that partisan gerrymandering claims are non-justiciable, which means that a federal court cannot consider a claim that a district is, for any level, is an unfair partisan gerrymander. So federal courts for partisan gerrymandering claims are out. In some states, we've seen lawsuits, many of them brought by ACLU affiliates, where people have gone to state court on partisan gerrymandering claims. Most notably Ohio and North Carolina. Where those have been most successful, they either have an express provision in the state constitution, like Ohio does, that says explicitly in the state constitution that there shall be no partisan gerrymandering and that state courts can enforce it, or they have partisan elections with a state Supreme Court majority that is of a different majority party than the legislature, like in North Carolina. So that's a 4-3 Democratic split on partisan elected Supreme Court. New Hampshire has neither of those things. So the closest we come is Part 1, Article 11 of our state constitution, which says basically that all elections shall be free and fair. And of course, we have appointed judges. 3 of the 5 judges on the New Hampshire Supreme Court have been appointed by Governor Sununu, who's of course of the same party as the ruling coalition. New Hampshire courts have never ruled that any plan is a partisan gerrymander, nor have they ever said that partisan gerrymandering is explicitly prohibited by the New Hampshire state constitution. So, you know, that's what anyone who's developing a partisan gerrymandering lawsuit would be considering. Now, the other type of lawsuit that we've seen a lot of the cycle, there are 2 more that I'll just cover. One is the Impasse Lawsuit that we've seen just got filed last week, which basically says the political branches can't do this, so the courts have to. We've seen that type of lawsuit happen in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota, because, and it's most successful where the governor and the political branches are of different political parties. So like the Republicans in Pennsylvania pass a map, the governor vetoes it, nothing else happens, it gets drawn by the courts. And then the third type that is more along the lines of what we've seen in Alabama and Louisiana is a Voting Rights Act lawsuit, which is basically a challenge saying this is an unfair racial gerrymander. And unlike with partisan gerrymanders, racial gerrymanders can still be considered in federal court. Cases have been successfully proven in Alabama, but through something called the Purcell Principle have been stayed by the U.S. Supreme Court. I can tell you that I don't think that the demographics of the state of New Hampshire would support necessarily a Voting Rights Act lawsuit for the state Senate or Executive Council or Congress. I think it's possible that there could be one in the state house, maybe in a couple places like Manchester and Nashua, where perhaps a colorable claim could be made that minority voters are being denied an equal opportunity to participate in the political process by basically having districts that could be majority minority that are majority white anyway. I'm not aware of anyone's developing that lawsuit. One hasn't been filed in New Hampshire before. So that's sort of like the top line maps. I guess what I'd say in general is it's still sort of an open question whether someone could go to New Hampshire, the New Hampshire State Court, and file a partisan gerrymandering lawsuit and be successful. But in general, people caring about these issues should not be banking on the courts to save them. We have to save ourselves.
Well, and so just as a way to kind of wrap up this part of the conversation about redistricting before we focus on some of the bills that are working their way through the general court right now, what would you recommend? I'd be curious to hear from everyone. At this point in the process, what would you recommend for folks who are on the call or might be viewing the recording later? How can they take action related to redistricting at this point in the process?
So if I can just, and I'm sorry, I know I'm talking a lot, but I've got a link that we've got of 5 ways that you can take action. And I don't, I'm just going to send this into the chat, and hopefully one of our esteemed hosts will find a way to get this to the attendees, but just a link to our campaign.
So my point of view is this is the time to talk to the governor. The governor has said repeatedly that he is opposed to partisan redistricting. He will veto bills that look like they're gerrymandered, and we've got to keep holding his feet to the fire. He's done it on the congressional maps. He needs to look very carefully at the Senate map, where there are now only 4 competitive districts out of 24. Everything else leans one way or the other. And he's got to look at the executive council map for the same reason. So put the pressure on the governors, call his office, send him email, send postcards, send a letter. Make sure he knows that he's running for office in the fall. And he can't ignore the voters who say, we expect you to treat this important issue and keep your promise about vetoing gerrymandered maps. So that's what the league is advising at this point.
Great. Paul, anything else to add as we pivot?
I'll add what to do in the fall after this is all over. Liz touched upon it a little bit when she talked about how difficult it would be for, let's say, a Democrat to win in a heavily Republican district and vice versa, for a Republican to win in a heavily Democratic district. But that doesn't mean we should concede, let's say, a Republican district to a free stater who might be an incumbent, because just like the entire electorate has a wide spectrum of someone who's extremely conservative and someone who's extremely liberal, within each party, there's a spectrum of beliefs. And you will have far right and centrist and far left people in both parties within the constraints of their party philosophies. So frankly, if there's an extreme person, perhaps a so-called free stater in a Republican district, and you want someone else to be elected, then perhaps find a centrist candidate, Republican candidate, to run against them, and then go out and knock on the doors. And that was another question that just popped up. How can knocking on doors overcome the gerrymandering problem? Face-to-face contact really does make an impact on whether or not a voter will remember you, especially in House districts where someone might have multiple votes to cast. Maybe they'll be voting for 3 candidates, vote for up to 3. And so that's important. And even though there's 1 state rep for every 3,443 residents, those are residents, not registered voters. So maybe we're only looking at about 1,500 registered voters. So you don't have to knock on 3,000 doors. You're going to knock on less than 1,500 because each household might have a couple of voters. So knocking on doors can be very effective. It does take a time commitment, but believe me, when you talk to the voters face to face, they'll remember you. And when they go in the ballot box, that will mean something.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. It's very much the New Hampshire way. Yeah, Liz, do you have anything else to add?
Just one more thing.
Yeah.
How do you find out about these candidates? How do you know who they are, especially when you're voting in the primary, where you have a leaning for one party or the other, and now which candidate do you vote for? So I think it's very, very important, first of all, that people plan to vote in the primaries, and then that they find out all they can about the candidates. Go find their Facebook pages, look them up in Google them and see what they've done in the legislature before. There's an organization called Citizens Count that's online, and they will do some snapshots, in a sense, little bits about candidates, especially about incumbent candidates. So if it is an incumbent, you say, what kind of things did he or she vote for? You can find that out from citizens count. So it's more than just going to the polls in November. You've got to plan on the polls in September, and you've got to plan on doing your homework before each of those elections.
Great. Some great resources that you just rattled off, Liz. Thank you for highlighting those. I think what I'd like to do now is to look at some of the bills that have continued to make their way through the legislature. Specifically, I want to focus on Senate Bill 418. Would love it if someone can just kind of share what is this legislation, what all will it do, what kind of harmful effects will it have on our democracy, and why should we be worried about it?
Well, I can give you a little summary of what the bill will do, and Henry might be able to add to my notes. Senate Bill 418 is titled Relative to Verification of Voter Affidavits, but that's not a clear description of what the bill's language really contains. It proposes creating an affidavit ballot for voters who appear at the polling place without an ID. And then if the number of affidavits ballots cast exceeds the number of votes separating a winning candidate from a losing candidate, the Secretary of State shall extend the period for a recount. And the Constitution or the state law defines how long of a period after an election recount shall take place. The affidavit ballot voters need to provide within 10 days after the election proof of who they are or where they live. And so if a voter hasn't done that, then the Secretary of State can direct the moderator or the clerk to retrieve that person's ballot out of the cast ballot boxes. And the way that would be done is the affidavit ballots are supposed to be hand counted on election night and packed in their own box. They're not to be mixed with other ballot boxes. And each absentee affidavit ballot, long terms here, is marked with a number. Let's say it might be marked number 1 belongs to John Adams. Number 2 was cast by Bill Smith. Number 3 by Kathy Jones. So you would find the name of the person who cast the ballot, find the ballot that matches up with them, and that's what's going to go to the Secretary of State's office. And any of those affidavit ballots where the voters didn't provide the necessary ID requirements would then be deducted from the final return of votes. They wouldn't be counted, in short. It's a very cumbersome process. Right now, it really probably couldn't be done within the time frame between a September primary election and a November general election, because there's a federal law that requires that absentee ballots be available in the general election for overseas voters, for veterans who are overseas and overseas citizens, at least 45 days prior to an election. So you can't have the recount process going on at the same time that these ballots are supposed to be produced and sent overseas. However, there's another bill that would move the state primary election to August. If that occurs, then there's enough time for this to happen. The two bills are kind of linked in that manner. Why is it not a good idea? Well, I think the votes that people cast, the ballots they fill out should be confidential. And the idea that we're going to go in and start pulling out ballots that are matched up with individuals' names and say that ballot's not going to be counted causes me problems. It also may be unconstitutional, and Henry might be able to address this piece of it, because all ballots are supposed to be cast and counted on election night, and we're essentially recounting those ballots. I shouldn't use the word recounting. We're disqualifying ballots after they have already been cast, and that's probably a step that constitutionally shouldn't be occurring. And without digging deeper into the weeds, I think that's probably as well as I can summarize it.
That's really helpful, Paul. Henry, can you talk a little bit more about how you're thinking about this bill and the concerns that you have about it?
Yeah, so I think that's a great summary. there's some other problems with it. So first of all, like, let's stipulate this is a solution in search of a problem in a pretty major way, right? So like the reasoning behind this, if you look at the whereas clause, is that, people submit affidavits when they vote. So like in 2020, over 800,000 people voted. About 1,500 people submitted an affidavit, either the citizenship affidavit or the domicile affidavit or whatever. And then the Secretary of State and the Attorney General's office iteratively go and investigate people who vote by affidavit or register by affidavit and either confirm that they are qualified or bring charges against them for voting illegally, or say in a small percentage of cases we can't figure out one way or another. So for example, I think in 2020, of the 800,000 people who cast a ballot, like maybe 66 people could not have their domicile verified. So you or I might look at that and say, okay, well, probably that's someone who just like didn't respond to a letter, and maybe they're not on social media and they haven't had any police contacts. And so, the state police did an okay job, but they just couldn't solve this person. They're probably there, maybe they're not. Even if they're not, that's not that many people compared to how many people voted. Other people look at that and say, oh my gosh, the world is falling. This election was stolen from President Trump. And they get out their, this meeting is being recorded. So what I'll actually just say is, some people think that this is going to like stop a massive web of voter fraud, which we know, and expert testimony presented as recently as 2019 has shown in court, that voter fraud in New Hampshire is vanishingly rare. Like 5 people a cycle maybe get convicted of wrongful voting of some type, and many of that wouldn't even be addressed by 418, but here we are anyways. So what this does is, if you register on election day for the first time in the state of New Hampshire without all of the documents you need, or if you vote without ID, as Paul said, you're given an affidavit ballot. The winner is announced, then 10 days later, it is recalculated where the ballots of people who didn't return their documents are removed, and then perhaps a new winner is announced. Would that wreak havoc on our first in the nation presidential primary if a new winner was announced? And like maybe, Bernie Sanders didn't win New Hampshire, maybe Amy Klobuchar won? Yeah, probably, right? Does that comply with the New Hampshire constitutional provision requiring that all ballots be cast on the day of the election? I don't know, probably not. Does it, what like upsets me about this the most, and I think is the most unconstitutional part about this, is that the practical effect of this is that it does away with the affidavits for people who are registering, because they're only good for 10 days. So if you register to vote and you don't have your birth certificate or your passport or naturalization papers, you don't have a way to prove citizenship. And so you sign an affidavit, and then if you can't get a passport within 10 days, and PS, like the State Department says, it takes 10 to 12 weeks to get a passport and $110, your vote is going to be recalculated and deleted. And in 2020, the 10th Circuit found that a similar statute in Kansas was unconstitutional, because you can't just prevent anyone who doesn't have a passport from voting, and yet that's basically what this bill would do. So I'm worried about it. I think thousands of people are going to vote without ID or register for the first time on election day in the state of New Hampshire without ID or one of their proofs, and are going to be given an affidavit ballot. I think it's ironic that people who are so concerned about voter fraud are willing to destroy the sanctity of the secret ballot, because in 1992, the United States Supreme Court wrote in a case called Bergeron versus Freeman, quote, "We, the Supreme Court, find that this widespread and time-tested consensus demonstrates that some restricted zone is necessary in order to preserve the state's compelling interest in preventing voter fraud, intimidation, and election fraud. All 50 states, together with numerous other Western democracies, settled on the same solution, a secret ballot, secured in part by a restrictive zone around voting compartments, as the greatest way to prevent voter intimidation or vote buying. And yet, here we are doing away with it. As Paul said, this is going to prevent us from complying with the federal statute that requires us to get ballots to people who are serving in the military overseas or who are abroad in a timely fashion, which is deeply problematic because it takes a long time to send mail internationally. I know this is, I was on my honeymoon in the South Pacific, and I wrote a postcard to my mother-in-law on Thanksgiving, and she didn't get it until the third week of December, right? And like, I don't know, that's a pretty long time. That's a month, right? Send a postcard. It can take a long time to mail things abroad, especially for people who are serving in combat zones or abroad. And that's why the federal statute requires that absentee ballots be sent 45 days before an election. And that would be, as the Secretary of State said, impossible to happen under this scheme. And the other thing that I'll just add on this is, that's been on my mind a little bit, was the Secretary of State supports this bill. He testified in front of the Senate Election Law and Municipal Affairs Committee that he supports it, although he also acknowledged that parts of it, like what I just said, need work. The day before he testified at Senate Election Law, he was talking with Peter Biello on All Things Considered about some of the federal voting legislation and about how his view was that all voting legislation should be nonpartisan or bipartisan. And the Freedom to Vote Act didn't have any Republican sponsors, and so we shouldn't support it. And then the very next day goes and testifies in support of a bill in the Senate sponsored by 11 Republican senators and 0 Democrats. So I'll let you draw your own conclusions about that, I guess.
Can I just weigh in quickly on that, Matt?
Please, Liz, yes.
So the mission of the League of Women Voters is to empower voters. And this bill does exactly the opposite. There are many reasons why people might not have all the documentation that we require and which they can currently sign an affidavit to verify. You have young voters, 18-year-olds who have not been able to afford driver's ed, don't have driver's licenses. They do not own their own homes. They're living at home. How do they prove domicile? And to disenfranchise people like that is just wrong. It angers me that this is happening just because some people claim anybody can come to New Hampshire and vote here, as though that's what's happening, and it's not happening. So we do have to keep some things in place that I'm sure the most liberal in the audience would say we don't need. Maybe some of you don't want voter photo IDs at all. But in New Hampshire, we have a pretty good photo ID law, that there are options to state issued photo IDs that can be used. And one of those is the affidavit. And the other, I totally disagree with the title of this bill saying it's about affidavits. It is a provisional ballot bill. And we all remember watching election results on TV nationwide and saying, oh, but we don't have the count for Pennsylvania because they have to count provisional ballots. Do we want to be one of those states? I don't think so. We want to know that the count we get on the night of the election is the accurate count, barring a very close race and a recount. We want to have that confidence. And so the very people who are sponsoring this bill, I think, are diminishing that confidence, and they are impinging on the rights of voters. So I'll keep fighting that bill for what it's worth.
Yeah, no, appreciate that, Liz. And Lynn jumped in the Q&A. She says, not a question, but I worry about those hoping to register the day of will forget or not pay attention that their vote is not complete, and that they have 10 quick days to finish the process. So very much in line with what you're saying. Janet asks, how likely is passage of Senate Bill 418? Do we have a sense of that? Paul, you've got a smile on your face.
You want me to speculate? And that's all it is, really, is speculation. It passed the Senate. It was the Republican majority. There's a Republican majority in the House. I think there's
13 to 11.
good. I do.
What'd you say, Henry?
13 to 11, Senator Ward voted against the bill because she was concerned, we think, with the way it targeted our overseas and military voters.
Got it. Has Chairwoman Griffin scheduled a hearing on Senate Bill 418 quite yet?
Not yet.
Okay.
No.
So we'll keep an eye on that. There were a couple other, questions that came in. I really like this one. It's from Shadeko. Said, finding my voice means having enough information to be confident enough to explain why I support or oppose a bill. If I go on the general court website, the wording of a bill can be difficult for me to sift through on my own. I realize there's Open Democracy, League of Women Voters, American Friends Service Committees, State House Watch, other political advocacy organizing projects. Please suggest first step for resources. I realize clear messaging is paramount.
I can take this one. The League of Women Voters of New Hampshire. First stop, last stop, Liz Tentarelli.
And Liz, you mentioned a few resources just for understanding who's running for office and trying to get a sense of who they are and what their platform is. But can you talk about how you look at a piece of legislation or any advice for citizens and how to engage around a bill like Senate Bill 418, which we understand is so problematic?
Well, I realize that for the average person, even when I've given directions on how you can look up the text of the bill, or I've given a link to it in my newsletter or something, that you get there and you're faced with anywhere from 6 to 15 pages of legal statements, and it is very hard. So I would say read any of those sources that you have come to trust, including the leagues and Open Democracy and American Friends Service Committee and so on. And then there are some that deal with health issues. New Futures is one of those. So get on those mailing lists, and organizations like League and those groups will try to summarize it. We'll try to distill it down to something that the average voter can understand. But it is very hard. And I think there should be a legislation passed that says bills have to be understandable. Probably is never going to happen. I also would love to see legislation that says no bill can make it to committee without having at least 3 sponsors and at least representing 2 committees. And we might get rid of some extremist bills. But that's my dream. That's not anything that's going to happen soon. So I sympathize with that.
Just a big shout out to one of the projects of the League of Women Voters is to try to make forms and pamphlets on how to register and how to vote in New Hampshire in plain English. And that's been a long time project of the League, and they do such an amazing job. And it's so important because, it's at best you're going to have, the statutes are written by a committee full of lawyers. And so the League does incredible work trying to put it in language that people can understand. And by the way, their lawsuit that they won on SB3, one of the complaints was that that SB3 was completely unintelligible, and that there were sentences that were like 112 words long that you needed a PhD to understand. And so, that's Liz living her dream in the legislature and in court.
Thank you, Henry. Yeah. And the Secretary of State claims he can't make these election laws too simple. They have to use the language of the legislation, and that's where you get in trouble. And, I would never use the word domicile, for instance. I would say where you live. So thank you, Henry, for pointing that out.
Yeah. Well, and Paul, as a former election official and now a legislator, what advice do you have for folks who are on the call who may want to make their voice heard? I mean, what concerns do you have about the implementation of Senate Bill 418, for example, and what advice do you have for folks?
There are a couple of ways to make your voice heard. You don't, a resident doesn't, a voter doesn't necessarily need to appear in person to testify on a bill. Doesn't need to write an email, doesn't need to write a letter or send postcards, all of which though does obviously help a lot. You can simply, if you can go to Concord, simply show up and sign in in favor or opposition to a bill. Sometimes committees, because of COVID, have allowed people to do this electronically. Since that's hard to do now, you can go to the committee website and send an email to all committee members. You just go to the committee website and it'll say email the committee and write your communication saying you support the bill, you oppose the bill. Maybe if you can give one or two reasons why. You don't have to dig down into all the elements of a 19-page bill, but use the resources that Liz and Henry have talked about to find those one or 2 points that you want to talk about. But let the let the committee members know that. I would also strongly encourage you to provide your address when you're responding or sending an email to the legislators, because Lord knows when we were dealing with the Wyndham recount bill, Senate Bill 43 last year, I was getting emails from as far away as Norway telling me what I should do because they were my constituent. And the only reason I knew that because of the email address, the country code at the end of the email address. So let the legislators know that you are local, you really are a constituent or New Hampshire resident, and I think that has an impact as well.
That's great. And this too, if you've got if one of your representatives serves on the election law committee, don't hesitate to reach out, give them a call, make it personal. And then, like every bill that goes, gets a public hearing, gets a recommendation in committee, and then goes to the floor of the House, every single representative is going to be voting on that. So that will be a time to make sure that you reach out to your representatives as a constituent to make sure that they know where you stand on Senate Bill 418. Or on any bill that is going to be debated on the House floor. So anything else? We're kind of getting close on time here, but we've had a really robust discussion, touched on redistricting, touched on Senate Bill 418, and I'm glad Senate Bill 3, which was struck down, was brought up because that is, I think that's a fear that a lot of us have about Senate Bill 418 is that it's cumbersome, it's going to deter people from participating in the process, and it's going to be throwing up all these additional barriers, and ultimately is pretty undemocratic. Actually, one question that we haven't gotten a chance to answer that came in from Jim says there's a push to go to hand count only in my town. Now I'm getting QAnon mailers being delivered with my other junk mail. I got one of those QAnon mailers over the weekend as well. Who's behind these attacks on the integrity of the elections and what's their ultimate goal in sowing distrust in our institutions? I don't know if anybody wants to take that one.
Well, I think the last few words of Jim's question actually is the goal of a lot of these people. That is to sow distrust in our institutions, which is unfortunate. There have been a lot of people who are trying to undermine democracy, undermine our institutions, and by sowing distrust in our elections and our institutions, that's what they're trying to accomplish, in my opinion. I don't know where the money is coming from to support these people. I do know that there are active groups in the state who are pushing the agenda of some of these folks, and it's an agenda that's being pushed nationwide. It's not occurring just here in New Hampshire. I will say that the effort to get a vote to have hand counts only in elections going forward was on the ballot of a lot of towns throughout New Hampshire during these most recent town meetings, and no community passed it. And I will give credit to the chair of election law. We didn't take up the bill that would ban that would require hand counts in all elections until we had the results from the town meeting, and she was pleased to announce that no one supported it, and then we killed the bill. So yeah, I wish I had a good answer for that, but it's a nationwide problem. And I think it is intended to sow distrust in our institutions and our election processes.
I have one suggestion, and this is not a partisan one at all. In fact, it's just the opposite. And that is if a group in a town or in a house district could organize a a discussion among sitting legislators, most likely House, but if you've got your senators nearby, bring them in, a public discussion of some of the issues. Let them tell you what's going on in their committees, let them give you their perspective, take some questions from the audience, and make this truly nonpartisan. Whoever is elected and you've invited them, if they come, you talk with them. I think that's the only way we're going to reduce some of this split and some of this distrust of one party of the other and of specific people. And it will also help you get a sense of who you want to vote for next time around. So if you belong to a women's club or some kind of civic group, try to set one of these up. It doesn't take much. It would be one evening. Just open the conversation. Try to be as even-handed in moderating it as possible, and really let the voters see who these people are who are representing them and where they stand on issues and what their perspective is of what's happened in the community. Just a suggestion, folks.
Liz, I think that's a great place to leave it. Get involved, find some of these nonpartisan groups to facilitate a conversation and to really understand where everybody's, what their position is and how they're viewing these issues that are so critical to our democracy. Henry, I'm going to let you have the last word, and then we're going to turn it back to Bev.
Great. I just wanted to put in a plug to everyone to follow the ACLU of New Hampshire on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. We talk a lot about voting rights and gerrymandering, but we talk a lot about a lot of other issues too. I hope that you consider us a trusted partner, but we're always talking about our view on what's going on in the courts and in the State House too.
Fantastic. And Liz, is there any place that we should follow what's going on with League of Women Voters?
Yes, we have a robust website. It's our acronym, LWVNH.org. And we have an issues and actions page that really keeps people up to date about what's going on in the New Hampshire legislature and with redistricting. So I encourage, and it's an open website. Anybody can view that. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, and really appreciate your expertise and your willingness to educate all of us on these issues that are, again, just so critical to the future of our democracy. Henry, Liz, Paul, really appreciate it, and I'm sure we'll be seeing you at the State House in the next few weeks. And really want to express our gratitude and appreciation to the Hillsborough County Democrats for convening all of us, for bringing us together. Bev, I'm going to turn things back to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I also want to get a little plug in. The Hillsborough County Dem, we do weekly messaging. It's pretty robust messaging. We target, we take a handful of very specific, either really good or really bad legislation that we see coming down this road, and we make it very easy for folks to click on that button to weigh in opposition or support, to submit written testimony, to connect with the committee and such. So if anyone would like to sign up for that, that's hcdccommunications@gmail.com, and we'll include that email address when we send the link out for tonight's recording. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. The panelists were fantastic. Liz, Matt, Henry, Paul, not only for tonight, thank you, but also thank you for all of the very good and important work that you do. Our next forum is on Wednesday, April 12th at 7 o'clock. And it is a clear-headed look at the debate on marijuana legalization. And we have 3 state reps joining us that night: Tim Egan, Manny Especia, and Sue Mullen, and also Kate Fry from New Futures. And it is being hosted by Steve Marchand. So that should also prove to be a great night. So again, thank you ever so much for joining us. And we will be sending out some important links to the folks who attended with us here tonight. Be safe and take good care. And thanks again.